Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam vajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Natha Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje Chaitanya Chandra Charitamrita Shuddha Sindhu Vrindavaniya Surasarmi Samunnimagna Jevai Jaganni Jaganai Swayama Punanti Tangs Vaishnavangs Harinama Parannamami Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohana Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Haite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhakta Maj Jai Rachido Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahatena Hoilo Morachita Jeba Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna upajibe priti janivera serariti shuni lei borohoihit Shriyatam shriyatam nityam giyatam mura Chintyatam bhaktas Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna, Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad nourished by Shri Rup, Shri Sanatan, Shri Raghunath, Shri Krishna Das Kaviraja Gosvami, an exuberant songbird in the inexhaustible sky of Gaura Lila, wherein the highest nectar of Sri Krishna Lila is sung to its full extent. Again, we will observe ourselves today in Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. So we resume in the Madhya Lila, the Sanatan Shiksha, chapter 22, discussion of the Abhidheya, and specifically we're here concluding the Prakaran on Shraddha, the eligibility or adhikar for the path of Uttama Bhakti, also known as the path of Ananya Bhakti or Shuddha Bhakti. So in our last reading, we discussed how Shraddha exists in a gradation. This gradation is divided into three parts, an advanced, an intermediate, and a beginner stage, and is determined by three principal factors: the relative firmness of one's Shraddha, and the relative expertise one has in the Shastra and in the reasoning necessary to understand Shastra. So to have knowledge of the texts, to have knowledge of hermeneutics, and to have conviction or the capability to adhere to what the texts say as per what one has understand them to say, these make one eligible to follow the path. And then, in addition to these primary criterions for Shraddha given here in the Charitamrita, then we began a summary of some of the additional criteria for introspection about the relative strength of Shraddha that are given by Jiva Gosvami in the Bhakti Sandarbha. So I've started a compressed summary of those. So today we'll continue that, and then we'll also look at another very important feature of the explanation of Shraddha for the path of Uttama Bhakti given in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which is a bit embedded in tikas into verses which are separated from each other and sometimes not always so clearly grasped. So we'll conclude today with another important point about the eligibility for bhakti from the Sindhu, and then conclude by putting together what we have in the Charitamrita, what we have in the Sindhu, and what we have in the Sandarbhas to get a compressed gist understanding of what is the eligibility for this path as per the Goswamis' collective teachings. So, the file I'm reading from is the same as last week. It's available in the Drive folder, so it should be there for everyone. So last time, I started this list of 9 points from the Bhakti Sandarbha. I'll just review the first 2 very briefly, since they're nice to review, and then we'll proceed into the remaining ones. So, Sri Jiva Pad also presents 9 means by which the relative firmness of someone's Shraddha can be further assessed in Bhakti Sandarbha. So, quote, how is the presence of Shraddha itself known? This is to be considered. Number 1, previously, taking shelter in Sri Bhagavan, Sharanagati, was specified as an indicator thereof, and the indicators of taking shelter in him are resolved for the favorable and so forth, which will be described ahead. And as I mentioned, those same 6 limbs of Sharanagati will also be discussed later here in this very same chapter of the Charitamrita. So we'll get into specific discussion of those later on. Number 2, so also the absence of poor-spiritedness and so forth. So by the quote, and so forth, we can make a catch-all category: parsimony, fear, anxiety, stress, dejection, depression, etc., in the midst of worldly affairs is also to be known as an indicator of Shraddha. In other words, one develops resilience to the difficulties of worldly existence by virtue of the conviction that one has in Bhagavan's guardianship for oneself, I who have taken shelter in him. As Bhagavan assures the Bhakta in the Gita, quote, I personally provide for the acquisition and protection of the necessities of those one-pointed, meditative, and ever-absorbed persons who worship me in full. So the extent to which I dedicate myself to him is the extent to which I can rest assured in his guardianship of me. So these points we discussed last time. Now we'll proceed. So I'm starting from part 3. A person endowed with Shraddha never has a lack of confidence, even in the powers heard about in Shastra, of objects, classes, qualities, and actions related to Bhagavan in connection with practical affairs of the world. Therefore, such a person's non-engagement with them, as a result of sussing out particular defects in them, by means of vision of them being ordinary material objects and so forth, shall never come about. They, meaning such objects, etc., are indeed possessed of such power, as is described in the Brihad Naradiya Puran. Quote, the water from Hari's feet is known to prevent untimely death, destroy all diseases, and cease all suffering. Some, however, even though they have Shraddha in these objects and so forth related to Bhagavan, are closed off from the effects of these objects and so forth, in that those effects do not manifest at present to them as a result of their own offenses. That is, those who have Shraddha in objects and so forth related to Bhagavan understand that as a result of offenses, the powers present in the objects and so forth related to Bhagavan that the Shastra says they possess are not seen to manifest to persons who have committed offenses. And thus those who have Shraddha in those objects and so forth have no lack of conviction in the statements of the Shastra or in the existence of such powers in those objects and so forth themselves, even though those powers and so on are not always seen to become practically manifest. So, I'll make a comment here. So, this citation from the Brihad Naradiya Puran. The water from Hari's feet can destroy all diseases and cease all suffering. So the conventional reaction would be, well, if that's so, then everybody who's ever gone to a temple and drunken Charanamrita would never have any more diseases and never feel any more suffering. But I certainly don't see that in the world, and I haven't experienced it in my own life, so this is just an exaggeration, or this is not true. This would be a conventional response to a strong claim like this. And throughout Hari Bhakti Vilas, where the, quote, Mahatmya, or the greatness of so many different acts of bhakti are described, you find countless statements like this, speaking about varieties of ritual worship or the chanting of Bhagavan's name, having the ability to, free one from diseases and end all suffering and do all these other things that seem very rare to ever occur. So someone might say, oh, this is just hyperbole, this is just some coercive measure to try to get people to engage in this, blah, blah, blah. It's not meant to be taken seriously. So if someone adopts that mentality, then they commit namaparad, because one of the offenses to the name, specifically the fifth offense as it's typically counted, is to consider the praises of Bhagavan's name, or the praises of chanting Bhagavan's name, to be mere exaggeration or mere artavad. So if a bhakta hears, okay, I can't think it's exaggeration, I have to think that it really happens, but yet it doesn't happen, but yet I haven't experienced that, or I don't see that other people are experiencing that. So how do I not think it's an exaggeration and also reconcile the fact that it doesn't seem to actually occur? Therefore, Jiva Gosvami provides this reconciliation in this explanation by saying that this power is present, but it is not necessarily perceived to take effect if there is an inhibiting factor present to that effect becoming manifest. Elsewhere in this same section, he gives the analogy of fire that's been soaked, wood that's been soaked in water. If we say there's fire inherently present in wood, it has the inherent potential to burn, and then you light it on fire and it doesn't burn, then someone will say, oh look, that's not true. It doesn't have the ability to burn because I can see for myself with my pratyaksha praman, it's not burning. So the response is that it does have the capacity to burn, but that potentiality is not becoming manifest because there is an inhibitor to the manifestation of that potential, namely the water in the wood. So similarly, aparad is like water on the wood, or it's an inhibitor in the psyche, or it's an inhibitor in the destiny of an individual that prevents some of these effects from becoming manifest. So, when one understands that there can be the presence of such an inhibitor, then one can reconcile the fact that these objects do have such power, and that the effect is not always, or frankly speaking, rarely seen. So, in this way, the bhakta has, quote, no lack of confidence in the powers heard about in Shastra. In other words, they do believe that drinking Bhagavan's Charanamrita can cure you of all diseases, or can protect you from all inauspicious effects, like the eclipse. Recently we had, a full eclipse, and I was getting some questions about that, and there's this place in Hari Bhakti Vilas where it also says that one who drinks Charanamrita is never subject to, quote, ashocha, which is this condition of becoming ritually impure as a result of a birth in the family, a death in the family, an eclipse, and other type of things. So this says, one who drinks Charanamrita, they're never subject to ashocha. And yet, you look around Vrindavan or you look around the Vaishnav society and everybody's afraid of the eclipse and, following all these fasts and doing all these things. But as per the Siddhanta of the Hari Bhakti Vilas, one who has Diksha is not ever subject to the effect of Sutaka. One who has a Nitya Puja Niyam, in the words of Sanatana Gosvami, who has a daily, regular practice of puja, never stops that puja, regardless of whether it's an eclipse or anything else, and has no consideration that the quote-unquote impurifying effects of an eclipse or other things can contaminate something so pure as the worship of Bhagavan. So, I bring this point up just to say that although people may have some degree of shraddha in worship or in the power of actions and objects and so forth related to Bhagavan, in many cases when push comes to shove, they just act like a sheep and follow what society does without clearly understanding how much conviction is necessary in having such activities. So that's what they call Gatanu Gotika, or the person who just goes along with whatever direction everyone else is going without coming to a clear understanding of what is meant to be done. So, the person with Shraddha and with the other features of the necessary adhikar, such as knowledge of the Shastra, knowledge of what the acaryas teach, such a person will not end up in such complicated, confused states. They will rather happily continue their puja. Anyway, I don't mean to excessively digress, but just to give a practical example. So, the main point here is that the person believes in the power of these things and also understands why that power is not always seen, and therefore has no lack of conviction even when the thing that they have conviction in existing is not directly observable. Okay, moving on. Jiva Gosvami goes another layer on this subject matter. Quote, since, however, even those who have Shraddha in the statement, quote, one who shall remember he of lotus eyes is externally and internally pure. So this is a very well-known statement. Many times you'll see people evoke it in some condition of traveling or some situation where they're not able to bathe in a conventional manner, where, Yasmarit pundarikaksham sabhajabhyan tarasuchi, that person becomes internally and externally pure, who remembers pundarikaksha, Bhagavan, he of lotus eyes. So, this is a statement. Remembering Bhagavan, there's nothing more purifying than that. How is water more purifying than remembrance of Bhagavan? The Shastra says 4 things in the world are pure. Ganga water, and the, givings of a cow, and I forget the 4th one, and the 3rd is a mind fixed on Vishnu. There's nothing more pure in the world than the mind fixed on Vishnu. So, you want to tell me that, the water coming out of your drain out of your spout full of all the whatever chemicals that are in it, that's more purifying than the mind fixed on Vishnu? Never. The mind fixed on Vishnu is the most purified thing. So, even though that's the case, and even though a bhakta has conviction in that, what do we observe? We observe that such a bhakta engages in bathing and so forth. Let me read the whole sentence. Since, however, even those who have Shraddha in the statement, one who shall remember he of lotus eyes is externally and internally pure, and so forth, engage in bathing and so on. That performance of acts that would seem to be redundant to perform is one who has Shraddha in particular statements in the Shastra, is to be understood as being done only out of reverence for the conduct established by the parampara of sadhus led by Narad and Vyas. So if you really believe that you're pure by remembering Bhagavan, then why bother bathing? If you're bathing, that means you don't believe it. This would be the argument. So no, it's not that they don't believe it, they do believe it. And they still bathe, even though that might seem redundant, because Narad, Vyas, the other Mahajans have enjoined that as the proper protocol for Vaishnavas. So this is what is called marjana. In the Caritamrta, there's a famous statement, marjana palana ba marja rakshana hoi sadhura bhushan, that observance of the standard protocol enjoined by the Mahajans, enjoined by the Shastra, is the ornament of a sadhu. In other words, it's the endearing character, it's the endearing appearance and effect of the sadhu, that they always attend to and care for this. The fourth of the 64 limbs of bhakti mentioned in the Sindhu is Shastra Marganugaman, to follow the path given in the Shastra. In other words, the path laid out by the Mahajans like Narad and Bas. So, did Narad and Bas not think that you'd be purified by bathing? They're the ones who taught you that. And they still tell you to bathe. So, Jiva Gosvami explains, otherwise, if those with Shraddha were to neglect to observe the traditional conduct established by Mahajans like Narad and Bas, just by transgression of that, meaning of the conduct established by Narad and Bas, offense would occur. It is thus to be understood that they have established such etiquette specifically to prevent troublesome behavior and so forth, that is, unsociable habits and the like, in a person in general. And thus bathing even after remembering Bhagavan should not be considered a symptom of lacking Shraddha in the power remembrance of Bhagavan has to purify one of all impurities. So you shouldn't think that because someone bathes, they don't believe that you're purified just by remembering Bhagavan. Rather, they believe that, and they bathe because this is better as a social habit, as an etiquette and organization of society. And they do so in accordance with the teachings of the Shastra, the same Shastra that taught them that they can purify themselves just by remembering Bhagavan. So if one were to neglect to observe this etiquette, that would be a disrespect of the Shastra, that would be a disrespect of the Mahajans, that would contravene the practice of following the path of the Mahajans that I just mentioned, this Shastra Marga Nugaman, and therefore would result in offense. So to preclude the occurrence of offense, they also follow the path while at the same time understanding the principle and see the utility of both. Okay, so that is point number 3. Now, the rest are more brief. That one is the only one that's a little bit elaborated. Number 4. Furthermore, when Shraddha is present, then in the stages of both accomplishment, siddhi, and non-accomplishment, or asiddhi, meaning whether one is a sadhaka bhakta or a sadhya bhakta, only continuous endeavor adherent to that, meaning that aforementioned etiquette established by the sadhus in the Shastra, shall occur just like that of one desirous of attaining gold. So the idea is, when someone's trying to get gold, in other words, when someone's greedy, they want the most efficient means by which they can get the maximum return on the energy and time that they invest in their pursuit. So if there's a particular way of extracting gold, of smelting gold to get it the most efficient way, then they're going to do exactly that. They don't want any swerving off of what is the ideal path so that they can get the best result from their efforts. So just like that, if someone has Shraddha in this, then they follow it. They stick to it very carefully. They're very strongly motivated. They don't want any inefficiency. They don't want any unnecessary, thwarting of their labor into something that won't produce the benefit that it could if it had been aptly applied. So, this is, you could say, a more practical symptom of Shraddha. To the extent that one has Shraddha, one is keen to aptly follow the path with maximum efficiency. So, in other words, if one thinks that, a bit of bhakti sadhana here and there, and then a bit of this and a bit of that, and that it's as if one of many activities that's mixed around, then that would be obviously symptomatic of a lesser level of conviction. So the extent of the conviction so the behavior becomes taught to what one has conviction in. Okay, then this similar idea is flushed out further in this coming points. So number 5, during that constant engagement in the means or sadhana to attain one's object, even a trace of any endeavor possessed of deceit, desire for prestige, pratishta, and the like, and so forth, does not occur. Ooh, this is a strong one, right? In other words, to the extent that one has shraddha, every thought, word, and deed that one has will be focused on pursuing the object that one has shraddha in, and following the path that one has shraddha in. So things that are contrary to that, this is the corollary statement, one will not be engaged in. So Sanatana Gosvami, he concludes the Hari Bhakti Vilas with this well-known statement, Sarvatyagepi apyaheya sarvanartha bhuvaschaye kuryat pratishta vishtayam yatnamasparshane baram. That even after successfully renouncing everything else, there is one thing that is difficult to renounce and the cause of all anarthas, the cause of all detriment and all problems on the path. That is, he dubs, quote, the stool of pratishta. So he says that therefore it's better not to let that touch you. So this is a play upon a pre-existent subhashitam within, Sanskrit literature, which says that it's better to avoid stepping in a puddle of mud than it is to step in it and then wash the mud off. Better to learn by hearing about it than having to go through the mistake and the difficulty produced by the mistake for oneself. Better to not step in the mud than step in the mud and then wash it off. So he says, not just mud, but stool is even more undesirable to step in and then wash off, rather than avoiding, better to just not step in it in the first place. So he describes pratishta as stool. So he says, try to not let this touch you. Asparshane baram. Non-touch is better. Better go for that. So the implication is that it is for a bhakta, especially a renounced bhakta, their livelihood in a practical, literal sense, from an external perspective, is based upon the support that they receive from the society that they live in. So attachment to that last, thread of worldly dependence is very difficult to give up. Now, as we mentioned earlier in point number 2, Krishna says, I provide for the necessities of my bhakta. So the bhakta that really has conviction in that will be indifferent to social opinion towards them. They won't have the hang-up that I need to present myself in a way that looks acceptable to society in order to receive the fundamental sustenance that I require from society in order to perpetuate my life and sadhana. Even that will ultimately be a hang-up, will ultimately be something that will hold one back, and Bhagavan wants to test and see whether someone really has conviction in him and in his capacity to guard his bhakta, and in a bhakta's depth of conviction such that they're ready to wear the hat of shame or the hat of excommunication from society for the sake of serving him. So, desire for pratishta, the desire to, have status in society, and moreover to, feed one's egotistical sense of aggrandizement, success, historical influence, superiority to others, etc. All these things are detrimental to the purity of one's conviction, the purity of one's bhakti. So, here therefore he's saying that if really one has shraddha, one really has conviction in this path of bhakti, in the value of the attainment of prem, then they won't endeavor for anything that's contrary to that. In other words, if you're, trying to hold water in a glass, you don't poke a hole in the glass so that it pours out while you're filling it up. You won't do something that's obviously contrary to the thing you're trying to achieve. So if you're really trying to achieve bhakti, then you won't allow anything that leads to the non-attainment of bhakti or that obstructs bhakti to come into one's practice. So in other words, with Shraddha, there's efficient engagement in what leads to the goal, and there's exclusion of everything that's contrary to the attainment of the goal. And more on that in point 6. Quote, therefore, intentional offenses as well, such as disrespect of mahats, do not occur, because of evident contrariety. That is, because an intentional offense is directly opposed to the habitual activity, mentality, and objective of someone possessed of Shraddha and thus has no scope to occur. So, having a desire for pratishta, it's highly unfavorable, but it's not exactly an offense. So he's going a step further and saying, if someone won't even bother to foster a desire for something that obstructs the attainment of bhakti, then that they would do things that are directly against the attainment of bhakti and harm the whatever accumulation, so to speak, of bhakti one has? Of course not. That's even more off the table, or that's even more antithetical to the Shraddha that one has. So, to the extent or the strength of one's Shraddha, so there will be a corroborating or a commensurate, manner of thought such that the inclination to commit any sort of aparad towards anyone will not arise. Okay, number 7. Alternately, even if someone with Shraddha, under the sway of prarabdha karma, and so on, has a habit of relation with sense objects, still, even at the time of relation with sense objects, because of that disturbance to one's sadhana, bhakti constituted of humility will certainly become enkindled in the person with Shraddha, as is stated in this regard in statements of Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad, such as the following, quote, both acceding to and condemning those objects of desire, the consequences of which are only ultimately suffering. And, quote, although obstructed by objects of the senses, a bhakta of mine who has not yet conquered the senses is generally not overwhelmed by objects of the senses by virtue of vigorous bhakti. So these are two very important statements in the Uddhava Gita. The first is directly relevant here. I'll just give a little bit broader citation for reference. He says, Jatta Shraddha Mot Kathasu Nirvina Sarvakarmasu Veda Dukatmakan Kaman Parityage Pyanishvara, which is the point that we discussed some classes back. The person has Shraddha, they have an indifference towards karma. In other words, they have the Shraddha, that bhakti alone is the thing to be done by which everything else is accomplished. But even though they have that conviction, and they have this knowledge, Veda Dukatmakan Kaman, that desires and the objects of desire, meaning worldly objects and desire for such worldly objects, are Dukatmaka. Fundamentally, they're constituted of suffering. In other words, you can never desire and enjoy an object of the world without there being suffering involved. It's constitutionally not possible. There's always some duke built in there. So they know that. They know that there's no ultimate fulfillment or no ultimate value to the pursuit of sensory experience. Pyarityage anishvara, but they're incapable of giving it up. Even though they know better, they can't give it up. Why? The samskar. Because their psyche is conditioned from so much past experience that this attachment, this inclination remains. So they have the conviction, they have the knowledge, but they're limited by the samskar. And footnote, this is what we're going to discuss later in this final point from the Sindhu, which is very crucial to understanding the adhikar for bhakti. This verse, the commentaries on this verse don't highlight it, but they also directly allude to it. So just remember that bit as we go on. So what to do? Tato bhajetamam pritya shraddhalur drida nishchaya. So therefore he recommends, as per this verse that we discussed in a recent class, that with firm conviction, with shraddha, one should still engage in worship of me. But if that person is incapable of giving up these objects of desire, then sometimes they're still going to engage with them. So what to do? Therefore, this statement quoted here, Jusha manas tatan kaman. He says, well then, sometime you're going to have to accede to that. If the psyche is such that it's so conditioned, you're not going to be able to give it up. Try as hard as you like. Sooner or later, you're not going to make it. You're going to accede to, you're going to again partake of something. So, what to do in that case? He says, Duko darkang shjagarhayan. Retain the awareness in the process of going through that experience that this is not something that will ever ultimately be fulfilling. In other words, try to have the presence of mind in the course of that experience to go through that experience in such a way that the samskara that is precipitating the experience is not intensified, is rather withered. In other words, try to not let the repeated experience further nourish the samskara for the object. So to sustain that type of mental balance, gradually, as a result of that, the samskara can wane. This is what is alluded to. And in the second statement, saying, although obstructed by objects of the senses. So this quote, obstruction by the objects of the senses, doesn't literally mean that these objects are obstructing you. Rather, the obstruction is the samskara for enjoyment of those objects, which is obstructing the person otherwise engaging in acts of bhakti, because the psyche is still riveting back to these other things. So that's alluded to by positing the cause of the obstruction in the object when it's actually the samskara for the object. But that person, a bhakta of mine who has not yet conquered the senses, in other words, although their psyche is not so purified that the vasana for bhakti is stronger than their vasana for all these other things, and thus the objects of the senses make no difference to them, although they're not at that stage, in other words, although the psyche is still significantly pervaded by worldly samskars, generally they're not overcome by those objects by virtue of vigorous bhakti. In other words, if the bhakti vasana by virtue of mahatsanga is strong enough, then there's a stage when it's strong enough that it doesn't get eroded by or tossed out and completely eradicated by ongoing sense experience, but it's not yet strong enough to oust the sense experience and the samskara for sense experience either. It's in a middle level of strength, like a good boxing match, let's say. Chakravarti Pad gives the analogy actually in his tika on this verse of warriors having a fight, and says that some, great warrior, he might go and kill or defeat his enemies without getting a scratch on his body. But that's quite rare. Usually, even the people who win the battle, they end up with some blood, some cuts, some damage along the way. So something like that, the sadhaka, their bhakti vasana is not so strong that they're able to just overpower all these things immediately, but it's not so weak that they just get defeated and give up the path. Rather, it's in the middle where they can still progress against this unfavorable mental conditioning, but it's a fight. And therefore they're, quote, generally not defeated, or they're generally not overwhelmed. Means sometimes, to some extent, they're damaged. To some extent, they revert, they make mistakes, they again act on these contrary elements. But on the whole, they're able to keep progressing on the path. They're able to keep gradually advancing or gradually intensifying the bhakti samskar, whereby the non-engagement in those unfavorable elements gradually becomes more and more, quote-unquote, natural, or more and more the general tendency that the mind has anyway. So, Jiva Gosvami gives a very nice point in reference to these two statements of the Bhagavad by saying, quote, "Bhakti constituted of humility, dainya, will certainly become enkindled." So this is to say that when that fight is going on and that bhakta is feeling the challenge, or he's experiencing within his mind the current of his thoughts going away from acts of bhakti and again into non-bhakti content, then what is the response that comes in the heart of that bhakta at that time? The response is another form of bhakti, quote-unquote, dainyatmika bhakti, is the way he words this, which is a very interesting phrase. So, bhakti constituted of dainya. So, dainya is discussed elsewhere in the Bhavartha-dipika, other works of the Goswamis, as a sense of unsuccessfulness or a sense of lack, a sense of consternation, or rather disconcertion. So, to feel even disconcerted about the mind's being displaced from absorption in bhakti is also an expression of regard for bhakti. So, in this way, even the unfavorable thoughts that arise in the mind due to the residual presence of non-bhakti samskaras can also become such that they trigger thoughts of the absence of bhakti. They can still then remind one of bhakti. They can still be, so to speak, channeled or redirected such that one's longing for bhakti, such that one's valuing of bhakti as being principal and above all, is still sustained. So when a bhakta has sufficient samskar, that when they then find themselves thwarted from engagement in bhakti, that this state of disconcertion in the heart, this state of longing, this state of absence in the heart is felt, such that then they pray for, again, the mind becoming absorbed in bhakti, such that they then again pray to Bhagavan, and that misdirection of the mind is then itself turned into a lever or turned into a trigger that reminds them of bhakti and reminds them of Bhagavan. Then even that unfavorable samskar can be turned into a lever or turned into a point of momentum which can be push one into bhakti. So, there are certain types of martial arts where you use the power or the force of the person attacking you, you turn it back on them. So this is essentially what's being referred to here, where the thrust of the non-bhakti samskar is then able to be reverted or channeled back into something that nourishes the bhakti samskar. So therefore there's a famous Bengali saying, Krishna Bhakta Boro Chatur. In other words, there's nobody as clever as a Krishna Bhakta. In other words, this is the genius, so to speak, of how these teachings are laid out, is that when they're understood, even all elements of unfavorability can also be converted into things that become at least secondarily favorable to, or can be channeled into something that supports the pursuit that one has. And that is the power or the utility of knowledge, specifically knowledge of the path of bhakti. So, in summary, the point he's making here is that when people have shraddha, but they don't have all that much chitta shuddhi, and the bhakti samskar that they have is not all that strong, then they will struggle, but in response to that struggle, they will also respond with dainya and the acts of bhakti that are coupled with dainya, such as prayer, such as longing, such as remembrance of Bhagavan. So in that way, they're not completely overcome, or they're not defeated, even in the midst of these obstacles. Okay, then I'm moving on. Number 8. Quote, when, however, Shastriya Shraddha, that is Shraddha based on Shastra, has developed in someone, then the impossibility of being of, that is, engaging in extreme misconduct, shall come about, because of contrariety in such misconduct to injunctions that are pleasing to Vishnu, such as, in the Vishnu Puran, quote, O king, Keshav is pleased by a person who does not think of others' wives, others' wealth, or others' harm. And because of contrariety in such misconduct to one's being a bhakta, as per another statement in the Vishnu Dharma Puran, quote, a human being who transgresses the code of conduct established by Bhagavan should not be recognized as a bhakta of Vishnu, since Hari is worshipped by virtuous conduct. So in other words, Jiva Gosvami is putting a limitation on what he said a minute ago. In other words, bhaktas who have still Vishai Asakti, or what's called Vishai Vasana, some inclination towards various varieties of worldly experience, they may from time to time still act on that. They may from time to time indulge, so to speak. But he's saying, but not that much. In other words, there'll definitely be a marked limit on that. And if it's quote unquote, dare I say, benign, in other words, if it's something that is entirely inoffensive and largely inconsequential, then perhaps, there'll be a period of indulgence. But if it's something that is outright immoral, outright detrimental to the well-being of others, then if the person actually has shraddha, there's no scope for that happening. So he uses this phrase, extreme misconduct, or when it comes to, quote, sudurachar. So this is, a hint at the verse in the Gita, apichet suduracharo bhajate mam ananya bhak. So in Jiva Goswami's viewpoint, that ananya bhak, or that person who has one-pointedness upon Bhagavan, does not have Shastriya Shraddha. Because if they did, they would never engage in any sudurachar. Meaning, maybe durachar, but not sudurachar. In other words, maybe some little wrong is possible, but if really they have conviction in the Shastra which lays down the moral codes, they're never going to do something that's completely immoral. In other words, even a child, once they burn their hand on the stove once, and knows and has conviction that fire burns, does not put their hand in the fire. There's just a natural, automatic corrective mechanism that kicks in the mind of a person for the sake of self-preservation, which inhibits one from performing actions that ones know are immediately detrimental to one's well-being. So if one has that conviction and that knowledge that engaging in immoral behavior, like stealing from other people, doing adultery with other people's wives, etc., is directly contrary to anything that could ever be pleasing to Bhagavan, anything that could be within the scope of the injunctions he's given for social life, then out of that, strong self-preservation tendency, so to speak, there won't be any scope for engaging in that. So if someone has conviction in such codes, that will not be coupled with such misbehavior. So in other words, someone might have conviction in those extremes, but if it comes to some benign sort of enjoyment, it might go on for some time. But if it's something extreme, then there's no scope for it occurring. This is why he gives these 2 points side by side. And the underlying point being that Bhagavan does lay down a moral code for society, and when someone's aim is to please Bhagavan, to adhere to the wishes of Bhagavan, then one will not transgress that code. Okay, number 9. Quote, the state of completeness of that is of Shastriya Shraddha, however, is described in Brahma Vaivarta Puran. Quote, first, deliberation proceeds. Quote, what is real and what is unreal here? Once such deliberation has been performed, O king, full rejection of the unreal is effected, and then Shraddha, bearing the greatest fruit, shall become complete. So what this applies is that mature Shraddha emerges as a result of deliberation, or what is called vichar. In other words, this is not, quote, blind faith or just merely some, egotistical tendency to have strong conviction in whatever one was culturally raised in, or whatever one's family customs are, or whatever one may have so elected to join at some stage in life. This isn't some reactionary, attempt to inflate one's own ego by being immovable in one's adherence to whatever it is that one thinks is mine or that one is a part of. Rather, this is based on deliberation. This is based on analysis of its merits and demerits from an impartial perspective. And when it emerges that this is something truly meritorious and worthy of having conviction in, namely bhakti, then that Shraddha becomes, quote, mature, or it becomes complete. So this implies the necessity of what was described in the last class, Shastra and Yukti. Rather, to hear the teachings of the Shastra, to understand them with the appropriate hermeneutics, this is the only way to engage in vichar, or what is otherwise called nirnoy, to ascertain the meaning, the intent of what is said, thus so as to arrive at the object that is being described or being exalted. So this is a very important point, which ties right back to the points that are made in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and quoted here in the Caitanya-caritamrta, that an uttam adhikari, or the highest class of bearers of eligibility for bhakti, are those who have expert understanding of what bhakti is, and the texts that teach it, as well as the method by which those texts are meant to be understood. So, Shraddha alone is the cause of being a bearer of eligibility for Ananya Bhakti, and that, namely Shastriya Shraddha, as we discussed already, as per also the commentary on the Sindhu, it is Shastrartha Vishwas, or conviction in the meaning of Shastra that's being discussed here, is, quote, not possible for one who is ignorant. Sorry. This is just fantastic. Right? Sacha agyasya na sambhavati. Put this on a billboard in the tirthas, right? Shraddha, what to speak of bhakti, is not possible for the ignorant. Unless and until you learn the Shastra from a sadhu, what to speak of having bhakti, you're not even eligible. I don't have an eligibility to practice it. Now, okay, let's be generous. The dog that went around the temple, the rat who waved the ghee wick, no doubt there's indirect benefit in people unknowingly, bluntly speaking, ignorantly engaging in acts of bhakti. We're not trying to obstruct that. We're not trying to speak against that. But this statement of Jiva Gosvami is very important. In other words, the cause of eligibility for bhakti, the ability to actually follow bhakti, is not possible for the ignorant. In other words, one has to learn what this is in order to actually do it. One has to have knowledge of the thing. Therefore, and this doesn't even only apply to bhakti, it also applies to dharma in general. There's a statement in the Mahabharata of Mahadev to Parvati, where he says that a little dharma done by a jnani, one who has knowledge of dharma, that is moham, that produces a great result. But a lot of dharma done by an ignorant person is nishphala, becomes fruitless. So you can labor, you can chant, you can do this, you can do that, you can do so many things. But if you're ignorant, it's not going to produce much, if any, result. Whereas if you carefully and properly understand what this is, do it a little bit, and it'll be of great value. It'll produce a great result. So this is the fruit of the Goswamis' labor, or in other words, they have taken it upon themselves with such care, with such expertise, with such brilliance, with such satisfying vichar, or deliberation upon all of these things. They have laid out so many wonderful, wonderful, wonderful points for us to understand about how to follow and how to conceive of what is bhakti to Bhagavan. So let that not all be chucked aside in the name of, championing some, parroted, cherry-picked statements about the Mahatmya of this or the Mahatmya of that. Rather, if you want to run around and tell society anything, tell them this. That it's not possible, if you're ignorant, to actually understand and follow what this is. And let people happily, soberly learn what this is and become deeply satisfied with the teachings that they've given, which really, really are fully satisfying. I at least speak from a perspective of personal testimony. So, I'll conclude there for today. We'll have to leave this last point about the eligibility for Shraddha that's given in the commentaries on the Sindhu to next time. So, finally, to recap what we've discussed so far, quote, in summary, the depth of an individual's eligibility for the path of bhakti is determined by the relative firmness of their Shraddha and their relative expertise in Shastra and reasoning, both of which are instrumental in acquiring completely firm Shraddha. So, as per these points in the Bhakti Sandarbha, to support the points cited here in the Charitamrita from the Sindhu, we have understood this much. But there's one more point, which is not in the Bhakti Sandarbha or here in the Charitamrita, but is in the Durgama Sangamani and alluded to by Rupa Gosvami in the Sindhu. Another important point. We'll get to that next time. So, comments, questions, corrections, what have you, is welcome. Jai Shri Radhe. All right, well, if no one has anything to add. Oh.
Excuse me.
Okay, yes.
Did a jnani or somebody bhakta who is in full knowledge of the scriptures can perform. In brief, it can be also a siddhanta-charati. So how it is possible that a person who knows perfectly the Shastra can be a siddhanta-charati?
So knowledge and Shraddha are not the same thing. You can know things, but not truly have conviction in them. There's a statement, there's a Subhashita, I think it's in the Kadambari. It says that wise statements go only down as far as the neck of a wicked person, just like Amrita only went as far as the neck of Rahu. Okay? In other words, people can memorize things, people can parrot things, people can know theory, but knowledge of theory and Shraddha are not equivalent. Shraddha requires, as we're discussing today, knowledge of theory in order to become mature. But Shraddha itself is not merely or directly an effect of knowledge. Knowledge is one of its constituents, if you will, but it's not the only one. So therefore you find that people may have knowledge, but they may not have a great degree of Shraddha in the knowledge that they have. They may also have many unfavorable samskaras, non-bhakti samskaras as well. In other words, they may have a troublesome degree of, lack of purity of the consciousness, such that they struggle to adhere to what little conviction they have in respect to what they may proportionately have as more knowledge. In other words, you can be an intellectual, but still be wicked-minded, or still, suffer from many, unfavorable karmas in past lives and have unfavorable, conditioning in the psyche, even if intellectually you might grasp many things. Does that address your question?
Yes. So what I understand that actually Shraddha is not dependent of the degree of knowledge. It is exactly what you said.
Well, Shraddha requires knowledge, but it's not that knowledge alone is the constitution of Shraddha.
Okay, so it requires something else, probably.
Right. In other words, when I say Shraddha in this context, I'm talking about the Shraddha as defined here, right? In a broader sense, this idea of Shraddha, or having regard, having conviction, that you might call it like another muscle group, if you will. You know, like knowledge and the capacity to conceive, that's one type of strength, that's one thing. And then the capacity to sustain that conviction, the capacity to live on that conviction, the capacity to adhere to that content that one knows, that is like a complementary muscle group, if you will. And so the Shraddha defined here is the outcome of both of those things. In other words, the samskara, the capacity to hold a focus, hold a conviction, and the capacity to conceive of and grasp the subtlety of the object to be understood. When those two things fuse together, you get the adhikari, or you get the person who's eligible. So that's why in the previous class, right, he's saying that someone can have drida shraddha, if you look at the way the madhyam adhikari is given in the Caitanya-caritamrta, the person has drida shraddha, but lesser acumen in terms of knowledge of Shastra, knowledge of yukti. So that itself demonstrates that the capacity to hold conviction is not only a function of the knowledge that the person has. But when there's both the ideal accuracy of the object in which to hold the conviction and a commensurate strength and capacity to have the conviction, then you get power, or then you get the eligibility that's being alluded to or being praised in this text. Does that help clarify it?
Yes, Prabhu, I will work on understanding better these principles. But yes, it's a beginning of understanding for me. Thank you, Babaji. Jai.
Bobby, are you there?
Yes.
So it sounds like this is really a long process in the sense that I say we're in the West, our samskars are not that great. It takes a while, you get a book, gradually you gain knowledge, gradually you gain association, but you're dealing with all these samskars. It really, in other words, you can't tell by someone's a presentation whether they're an advanced devotee or not. They may have so much knowledge, they may have some self-control, but the softening of the heart that comes with prema is really a subtle, subtle thing. Right?
Indeed.
So we really have to be in for this for the long haul. There's not going to be some quick delivery unless we're coming from multiple lives of sadhu sangha.
That's highly likely the case, to put it frankly.
Yeah. All right. Your classes are very inspiring. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad. And if we have a bit of Shraddha in that thing, then we say, however many lives it takes, however far it is, I'm up for it. I'm down. I want to go for that journey. Whether it's long or it's short, doesn't matter to me. It's worth it. So if we can accumulate conviction and appreciation for the value of the thing, then however long it takes, that'll be all right. It'll ultimately, we'll even dare say that the struggle that it took, the length that it took, will even add to the relish of the attainment.
John.
Okay, so that looks like it for today. So I'll conclude here, and we'll go one more class here on this topic of eligibility, and then we'll proceed into the next prakaran here in the Sanatana Shiksha. Vaishnavebhyo namo nama, Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Radhe Shyam.